October 1929. A black sedan rolls through the rain-slicked streets of Staten Island. Inside sits a young man named Charles Luciano, 28 years old, already known in certain circles as Lucky. He doesn't know it yet, but in the next few hours he will be dragged from this car, beaten within an inch of his life, stabbed, slashed with a knife, and left for dead on a desolate beach. 3 men will work on him with methodical brutality. They will cut him. They will strangle him with piano wire. They will leave him bleeding in the sand, convinced he is dead. But he will not die. And when the sun rises the next morning, the message he sends back to the men who tried to kill him will echo through the underworld for decades. It will establish a reputation so terrifying, so coldly calculated, that even the most hardened killers will think twice before crossing him again. This is not just a story about survival. This is a story about how a man transforms attempted murder into absolute power. This is the moment Lucky Luciano stopped being just another gangster and became a legend that would reshape organized crime in America forever. To understand what happened that night and why it mattered so profoundly, you have to understand the world Lucky Luciano was born into. Salvatore Lucania arrived in New York City in 1906. A 9-year-old boy from Sicily, speaking no English, carrying nothing but the weight of poverty and the promise of a new world. His family settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in a tenement that housed dozens of other immigrant families fleeing the same desperation. The streets were filthy, overcrowded, and dangerous. Children worked instead of attending school. Violence was common. The police were corrupt. And for young Salvatore, who would soon become known as Charlie and eventually as Lucky, the path forward seemed clear. The legitimate world offered nothing but dead-end factory jobs and grinding poverty. The illegitimate world offered opportunity, respect, and the chance to build something that mattered. The Lower East Side in the early 1900s was a pressure cooker of human desperation and ambition. Italian immigrants were packed into buildings that violated every conceivable safety code, buildings where multiple families shared single rooms, where disease spread like wildfire, where infant mortality was staggering. The air smelled of garbage and industrial smoke. The noise never stopped. Horses and carriages clattered over cobblestones. Street vendors shouted in a dozen languages. Factory whistles blew at dawn and dusk, marking the beginning and end of 14-hour shifts for wages that barely covered rent and food. This was the America that awaited the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. This was the reality behind the promise of the Statue of Liberty visible across the harbor. Young Salvatore saw his father work himself to exhaustion for pennies. He saw his mother take in laundry and sewing, working by candlelight long into the night just to keep the family fed. He saw other families evicted onto the street when they couldn't pay rent, their possessions piled on the sidewalk, their children crying in confusion and fear. He saw men broken by the factories, by the docks, by the endless grinding labor that destroyed bodies and offered nothing in return. And he saw something else. He saw men in fine suits who never seemed to work but always had money. He saw respect given to those who took what they wanted rather than begging for what they needed. He saw a parallel economy, a shadow world where the rules were different and the rewards were real. By the time he was 10 years old, Salvatore Lucania was already running errands for local gangsters, already learning the street economy of protection, gambling, and petty theft. By 12, he had formed his own small gang, a collection of Italian and Jewish kids who stole, fought, and survived together. One of those kids was Meyer Lansky, who would become his lifelong friend and business partner. A relationship that transcended ethnic boundaries and demonstrated Luciano's early understanding that money and power had no nationality. While other Italian kids were being taught to distrust Jews, while other Jewish kids were learning to avoid Italians, Luciano and Lansky recognized each other as kindred spirits. Two highly intelligent boys trapped in poverty who understood that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. By his teenage years, Charlie Luciano was already running with street gangs, already learning the fundamental rules of the underworld. He understood early what many gangsters never learned. Violence was a tool, not a goal. Loyalty was conditional, not absolute. And the real power came not from being the toughest guy on the block, but from being the smartest. He watched the older generation of criminals, the Mustache Petes as they would later be called. Men who clung to old world traditions, who refused to work with anyone outside their immediate ethnic group, who saw the criminal world as a series of tribal conflicts rather than business opportunities. Charlie Luciano saw their weakness, he saw their limitations, and he began building something different. During Prohibition, which began in 1920 with the Volstead Act, the American underworld exploded with opportunity. The government had criminalized alcohol, creating the largest black market in American history. Suddenly, every speakeasy, every warehouse, every truck route, every corrupt cop and politician became a potential gold mine. Gangsters who had been running small-time rackets were suddenly coordinating operations worth millions of dollars. And Lucky Luciano, still in his early 20s, was right in the middle of it, forging alliances, making deals, and building relationships that crossed traditional boundaries. He worked with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel. He partnered with Irish mobsters. He understood that money had no ethnicity, that business had no borders, and that the future belonged to those who could organize, coordinate, and think beyond the narrow confines of neighborhood loyalty. By the late 1920s, Luciano was rising fast. He was making serious money in bootlegging, narcotics, and prostitution. He was known as a sharp dresser, a smooth operator, someone who could move between different worlds with ease. He had connections with powerful people. He had the respect of serious criminals, but he also had enemies. And in the world he operated in, having enemies meant living with the constant knowledge that death could come at any moment, from any direction, often from people you thought you could trust. The old guard of the Italian mafia, men like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, were locked in a brutal power struggle known as the Castellamarese War. This was not a war over territory or insults or vendettas, although those elements were certainly present. This was a war over the future direction of organized crime in America. Would it remain a collection of ethnic gangs fighting over scraps, or would it evolve into something bigger, more sophisticated, more profitable? Masseria represented the old way. He was crude, violent, suspicious of outsiders, unwilling to adapt. Maranzano was more sophisticated but equally tied to the old hierarchies and traditions. And caught in the middle were younger men like Luciano who saw both sides as obstacles to progress. But on that night in October 1929, Lucky Luciano's concerns were more immediate. He had been summoned to a meeting. The details were vague, as they often were in that world. Someone needed to talk. Someone had business to discuss. It could have been legitimate. It could have been a setup. In Luciano's world, you never really knew until it was too late. He got into the black sedan. The driver was someone he knew, or at least someone he thought he could trust. They drove through Manhattan, across the bridge, into Staten Island. The rain was falling steadily, the roads were dark, and then, at some point during that drive, everything changed. The exact details of what happened next have been debated and embellished over the years, but the core facts are undeniable. Luciano was taken to an isolated location. 3 men were waiting for him. They were not there to talk business. They grabbed him, dragged him from the car, and began beating him with savage efficiency. These were not amateurs. These were professional killers doing a job. They punched him, kicked him, slammed his head against hard surfaces. When he fought back, they beat him harder. When he tried to talk, to negotiate, to offer money or deals or information, they ignored him. They had their orders. He was supposed to die. The exact details of what happened next have been debated and embellished over the years, but the core facts are undeniable. Luciano was taken to an isolated location. 3 men were waiting for him. They were not there to talk business. They grabbed him, dragged him from the car, and began beating him with savage efficiency. These were not amateurs. These were professional killers doing a job. They punched him, kicked him, slammed his head against hard surfaces. When he fought back, they beat him harder. When he tried to talk, to negotiate, to offer money or deals or information, they ignored him. They had their orders. He was supposed to die. Imagine those moments from Luciano's perspective. He is 28 years old at the height of his physical powers, a man who has been in countless street fights, who knows how to handle himself in violent situations. But this is different. This is not a bar brawl or a territorial dispute. This is an execution. The men attacking him are methodical, professional, emotionless. They are not angry at him. They don't care about him personally. He is simply a problem to be eliminated, a name on a list, a job to complete. When he tries to fight back, when his training and instincts kick in and he lands punches, when he manages to create space or break a hold, they just keep coming. 3 against 1. Experienced killers against even an experienced street fighter. The mathematics are inevitable. The beating seems to last forever. His face swells, his ribs crack, blood fills his mouth, his vision blurs. He can feel himself weakening, can feel his body beginning to shut down from the trauma. And then they take out the knives. The cold metal against his skin, the sudden sharp pain as the blade penetrates, the warm flow of blood soaking his clothes. They slash his face, deliberately disfiguring him, marking him even in death. The knife cuts across his cheek, through muscle and nerves, a wound that will leave his face permanently altered. They stab him in the back, feeling for vital organs, trying to puncture lungs and kidneys. Each thrust is precise, professional, designed to cause maximum damage. When the knives aren't enough, when he somehow remains conscious despite the catastrophic injuries, they bring out the piano wire. They loop it around his neck and pull it tight, cutting into his throat, crushing his windpipe. Luciano gasps for air that won't come. His hands claw at the wire, trying desperately to create space, to breathe, to live. His vision narrows to a tunnel. The world becomes distant and muffled. He can feel consciousness slipping away, can feel his body giving up. This is how he will die, he thinks, strangled on a beach in Staten Island, murdered by men whose names he may not even know. Just another casualty in the endless gang wars that consume men like him. Then they take out the knives. They slashed his face, cutting deep, leaving wounds that would scar him for life. They stabbed him in the back, puncturing organs. They strangled him with wire, cutting into his throat, trying to crush his windpipe. They worked on him for what must have felt like an eternity, methodically destroying his body. And when they were finally finished, when they were convinced he was dead or dying, they dumped him on a beach in Staten Island and left him there in the rain. They drove away, confident that they had completed their assignment, that Lucky Luciano was finished, that the world would find his body in the morning, and that would be the end of it. But Lucky Luciano did not die. He lay there in the sand and the rain, bleeding, broken, barely conscious, but alive. His body refused to quit. His mind, even in that state, was still working. He knew he had to move. He knew he had to survive. Somehow, through sheer force of will and an almost inhuman capacity for endurance, he dragged himself off that beach. He found help. He was taken to a hospital. The doctors who treated him were amazed he was still breathing. The wounds were catastrophic. His face was destroyed. His body was full of holes. He should have been dead several times over. But he lived, and more importantly, he remained silent. The first hours in the hospital were critical. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize him, to stop the bleeding, to repair what could be repaired. They cleaned and stitched the facial wounds, dozens of sutures trying to hold together meat that had been torn apart. They operated on his back, extracting knife fragments, assessing internal damage, praying that vital organs had been missed by millimeters. They treated the strangulation injuries, the crushed cartilage in his throat, the damage to his vocal cords. One doctor would later say that he had never seen anyone survive injuries of that severity. Another remarked that Luciano's will to live seemed to override every biological law that should have resulted in his death. As consciousness returned in fragments, as the morphine allowed moments of clarity, Luciano's mind was already working. He knew that surviving physically was only the first step. He had to survive politically, strategically within the brutal ecosystem of the underworld. The men who had tried to kill him would be waiting for confirmation of his death. When that confirmation didn't come, when word spread that he was alive, they would face a choice. Try again immediately while he was weak and vulnerable, or retreat and hope that he would accept their failure as the end of the matter. Luciano understood that how he responded in these first hours and days would determine everything that followed. When the police came to his hospital bed, demanding to know who had done this to him, demanding names and details and explanations, Lucky Luciano told them nothing. Not a word, not a hint. This was not cooperation. This was calculation. In his world, talking to the police was worse than death. It was the ultimate betrayal. And Luciano understood something fundamental. His survival meant nothing if he couldn't control the narrative, if he couldn't turn this attack into an advantage. The men who tried to kill him had made a critical mistake. They had failed, and that failure was about to cost them everything. The police pressed him hard. They brought in senior detectives, prosecutors, even offered protection if he would testify. They explained that he had a legal right to justice, that the men who did this should be punished, that he could help break the back of organized crime in New York. Luciano listened with his one functioning eye, his face swollen and bandaged, and said nothing of value. He gave them a fabrication about being jumped by unknown assailants, about not seeing their faces, about having no idea why anyone would want to hurt him. The investigators knew he was lying. He knew they knew. But the code of the street was absolute. You handled your own problems. You settled your own debts. And involving the law was not settlement. It was surrender. The next morning, as Luciano lay in his hospital bed, bandaged and broken but very much alive, he sent a message. The exact content of that message has been the subject of legend and speculation. But the essence is clear and chilling. He sent word to the men who had tried to kill him. He let them know he was alive. He let them know he knew who they were. And he let them know that he was coming for them. But more than that, he sent a message to the entire underworld. He demonstrated that he was not just tough, not just lucky in the literal sense of surviving against impossible odds, but that he was someone who understood power in its purest form. He showed that he could absorb unimaginable violence and emerge stronger, more dangerous, more respected. The message, according to various sources and accounts that have filtered through mob history, was delivered through intermediaries, through trusted channels that ensured it reached the right people. Some say it was a simple statement of fact. I know who you are. I know who sent you, and I'm still here. Others say it was more elaborate, a detailed list of names, addresses, families, weaknesses, a comprehensive demonstration that Luciano had information that could destroy not just his attackers, but everyone connected to them. Still others claim the message was symbolic, a physical token sent to each man, something that conveyed the threat without words, something that made it clear they were now marked men living on borrowed time. One version of the story, repeated in certain criminal circles and never officially confirmed, suggests that Luciano sent each of his attackers a white handkerchief with a single red spot in the center. No note, no explanation, just the handkerchief delivered to their homes or handed to them on the street by silent messengers. The symbolism would have been unmistakable. White for surrender or death, red for blood for the debt that was now owed. The simplicity of it, the elegance, would have been more terrifying than any written threat. It said that Luciano knew where they lived, knew how to reach them, and was now thinking about them with the cold calculation of a man planning revenge. Another account suggests that the message was even more direct, that Luciano, from his hospital bed, dictated a list of every crime his attackers had ever committed, every person they had wronged, every secret they had tried to keep hidden. He demonstrated that he had been watching them, gathering information, building files long before they attacked him. The message was clear. If I die, this information goes to the police, to rival gangs, to everyone who would want to destroy you. But if I live, if you leave me alone, if you accept that you failed, then maybe you get to keep breathing a little longer. It was not forgiveness. It was a stay of execution conditional on their complete submission. What we know for certain is the effect. The men who had attacked Luciano, professional killers who had done this work before, were terrified. They understood immediately that they had made a catastrophic error. They had failed to kill him, which was bad enough, but worse, they had given him a reason to destroy them, and they had demonstrated to the entire criminal underworld that Lucky Luciano was someone who could not be killed by conventional means. His reputation, already formidable, exploded overnight. He became, in the truest sense, Lucky Luciano. The man who survived the unsurvivable. The man who stared death in the face and laughed. Word spread through the speakeasies, the gambling dens, the back rooms where gangsters gathered. Have you heard about Luciano? They tried to kill him, beat him half to death, stabbed him, strangled him, left him for dead. And he's still alive. And he knows who did it. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, but the core remained unchanged. Lucky Luciano had been targeted for elimination by professional killers and had not only survived but had come back with enough clarity of mind to send a message that made those killers afraid. In a world where reputation was everything, where the perception of invincibility could be more valuable than actual strength, this was transformative. But Luciano's response was not just about personal revenge. It was strategic. It was calculated. It was part of a larger vision. He understood that in the criminal underworld, fear was currency, respect was power, and the ability to turn a near-death experience into a demonstration of invincibility was worth more than any amount of money or territory. The old guard of the mafia, the mustache Petes who had likely ordered or sanctioned the attack, believing Luciano was becoming too powerful, too ambitious, too willing to break with tradition, had just made their biggest mistake. They had tried to eliminate a threat and instead had created a legend. In the months and years that followed, Lucky Luciano methodically consolidated his power. He did not rush. He did not act impulsively. He waited, gathered allies, built coalitions, and when the time was right, he moved against his enemies with decisive brutality. The Castellamarese War, which had been tearing apart the Italian mafia, came to an end. Not through traditional victory, but through Luciano's intervention. In 1931, Joe Masseria was assassinated in a Coney Island restaurant. The hit was orchestrated by Luciano, who had pretended to remain loyal while secretly working to eliminate him. Masseria's death removed one obstacle. Months later, Salvatore Maranzano, who had briefly claimed the title of boss of bosses, was killed in his own office in Manhattan. Again, Luciano was behind it, working with a coalition of younger mobsters who understood that the old ways were dead. With both of the old guard leaders eliminated, Luciano restructured organized crime in America. He established what became known as the Commission, a governing body that brought together the leaders of the major crime families to resolve disputes, coordinate operations, and prevent the kind of destructive wars that had plagued the previous generation. This was not a democracy. This was not about peace or justice. This was about efficiency, about maximizing profit, about creating a system that could survive law enforcement pressure and internal conflicts. And at the center of it all was Lucky Luciano, the man who had survived an assassination attempt and turned it into a foundation for building a criminal empire. The scars on his face, visible for the rest of his life, became his trademark. His drooping right eyelid, damaged by the knife attack, gave him a permanently menacing expression. But more than physical scars, the attack left him with something more valuable. It gave him a myth. It gave him a story that every gangster knew and repeated. It made him untouchable in a way that violence alone could never achieve. Men who might have challenged him, who might have plotted against him, who might have seen him as just another ambitious gangster, now thought twice. Because Lucky Luciano was the man who had been beaten, stabbed, strangled, and left for dead, and who had not only survived but had come back stronger than ever. Who ordered the attack on Lucky Luciano that October night? The truth is complicated and has never been definitively proven. Some historians believe it was Joe Masseria, who saw Luciano's growing independence and his willingness to work with non-Italians as a betrayal of traditional mafia values. Others point to Salvatore Maranzano or his associates, who may have wanted to eliminate a potential rival before he became too powerful. Still others suggest it was a rogue operation by lower-level gangsters acting on their own initiative. Perhaps trying to curry favor with one of the bosses, or perhaps settling a personal grudge. What matters is not who gave the order, but how Luciano responded. He could have retaliated immediately, could have started a war, could have allowed anger and revenge to dictate his actions. Instead, he waited, he planned, he built, and when he finally moved against his enemies, it was not in the heat of the moment, but as part of a carefully orchestrated strategy that eliminated not just the men who had attacked him, but the entire power structure that had allowed such an attack to happen. The legacy of that night in Staten Island extends far beyond Lucky Luciano's personal story. It represents a turning point in the history of organized crime in America. Before Luciano, the mafia was a collection of ethnic gangs operating in isolation, fighting over limited territory, bound by old-world traditions that limited their growth and effectiveness. After Luciano, it became a sophisticated criminal corporation, capable of coordinating operations across state lines, of corrupting entire political systems, of generating revenues that rivaled legitimate businesses. The transformation did not happen overnight, and it was not the work of one man alone, but Lucky Luciano was the catalyst. His survival, his response, and his subsequent rise to power demonstrated that the future belonged not to the toughest or the most violent, but to the smartest and most strategic. Consider the psychological impact of Luciano's survival on the criminal underworld. In a world where violence was common, where murder was a routine business tool, where showing weakness could be fatal, Lucky Luciano had been subjected to the most extreme violence imaginable and had emerged not weakened but strengthened. This was unprecedented. It violated the fundamental rules of that world. When you tried to kill someone and failed, you were supposed to try again until you succeeded. But with Luciano, that calculus changed. The men who had attacked him were now in hiding, now vulnerable, now aware that they had created an enemy who would never stop, who would never forget, and who had the intelligence and resources to destroy them completely. The message he sent that next morning, whatever its exact content, was really saying something much deeper. It was saying that the old rules no longer applied. It was saying that Lucky Luciano operated on a different level, with different methods, with a different understanding of power. It was saying that he could not be intimidated, could not be eliminated, could not be controlled. And for men who built their entire lives on controlling others through fear and violence, this was deeply unsettling. It meant that the game had changed. It meant that they were no longer the apex predators. It meant that someone smarter, someone more strategic, someone who understood that true power came not from inflicting violence, but from surviving it and turning it into advantage, was now in charge. Lucky Luciano's criminal empire at its height was vast and complex. He controlled bootlegging operations that stretched across multiple states. He dominated the heroin trade coming into New York City. He ran prostitution rings that generated millions of dollars annually. He had politicians, judges, and police officers on his payroll. He had legitimate business fronts that laundered money and provided cover for illegal operations. He had alliances with gangsters across ethnic lines, something that was revolutionary at the time. Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were not just associates but partners. Trusted advisors who helped build the financial and logistical infrastructure of his organization. This cross-ethnic cooperation, which seems obvious now, was radical in the 1930s and was directly enabled by Luciano's willingness to break with mafia tradition. But all criminal empires eventually face the law. In 1936, after years of operating with relative impunity, Lucky Luciano was brought down not by rival gangsters but by a crusading prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. The charges were related to compulsory prostitution, essentially running prostitution rings by force and coercion. The trial was sensational. Dewey presented dozens of prostitutes who testified about the organization, the methods, the violence used to control them. Luciano's lawyers argued that he was being framed, that the prosecution was relying on unreliable witnesses, that the whole case was a political maneuver by an ambitious prosecutor. But the jury convicted him on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison. Lucky Luciano, the man who had survived assassination attempts and wars and countless threats, was taken down by the legal system. But even in prison, Luciano remained powerful. He continued to direct his criminal organization from behind bars. He communicated through visitors, through corrupt guards, through coded messages. His influence did not diminish. If anything, his imprisonment added to his legend. He was now the boss who could run things from anywhere, who could not be silenced or contained. During World War II, in one of the stranger episodes of his life, Luciano allegedly cooperated with U.S. naval intelligence to prevent sabotage on the New York waterfront, which was dominated by his associates. The exact nature of this cooperation is disputed, but it resulted in a deal. In 1946, after serving 10 years, Lucky Luciano was released from prison on the condition that he be deported to Italy and never return to the United States. He spent the rest of his life in exile, first in Italy, then in Cuba briefly before being forced out by U.S. pressure, and finally back in Italy. He lived comfortably, maintained his connections to the American underworld, and continued to be involved in international narcotics trafficking. But he was never able to return to the country that had made him a legend. He died in 1962 at Naples Airport, reportedly of a heart attack while waiting to meet with a Hollywood producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. The final irony was that Lucky Luciano, who had survived so much violence, who had been beaten and stabbed and strangled and left for dead, died of natural causes far from the streets where he had built his empire. But the story that matters, the story that defined him, the story that every gangster since has known and remembered is that October night in 1929. 3 hitmen shot Lucky Luciano 6 times. They beat him. They stabbed him. They strangled him. They left him for dead on a beach in the rain. And the next morning, he sent them a message. The content of that message, the exact words or symbols or threats, may be lost to history or embellished by legend, but the meaning was crystal clear. You tried to kill me and you failed. I know who you are. And now you belong to me. That message, delivered from a hospital bed by a man who should have been dead, echoed through the criminal underworld with a force that violence alone could never achieve. It established Lucky Luciano not just as a survivor, but as something more, a force of nature, an inevitability, someone who could turn defeat into victory, who could transform attempted murder into absolute dominance. The men who attacked him that night disappeared from history. Their names are not remembered. Their fates are not recorded with certainty, though rumors persist that each met a violent end, that Luciano's revenge was slow and thorough and brutal. But whether they died quickly or suffered for years, whether they fled or tried to hide or attempted to make peace, the outcome was the same. They became footnotes to Lucky Luciano's legend. They became the men who tried and failed. And in the criminal world, failure of that magnitude is unforgivable. What can we learn from this story? What does it tell us about power, about survival, about the nature of leadership in the darkest corners of human society? Lucky Luciano understood something fundamental that many people, even in legitimate fields, fail to grasp. Power is not about being the strongest or the most violent. Power is about perception, about reputation, about creating a myth so compelling that people believe in it without question. When those 3 hitmen attacked him, they thought they were eliminating a threat. Instead, they created a legend. They gave Luciano the ultimate proof of his own invincibility. And he leveraged that proof into an empire. This is not a story that glorifies crime or violence. The world Lucky Luciano operated in was brutal, destructive, and ultimately self-defeating. He lived by violence, and he ruled through fear, and while he died of natural causes, most of his associates and rivals died violently, often young, often forgotten. The criminal empire he built enriched him and his partners, but destroyed countless lives through addiction, prostitution, extortion, and murder. There is nothing admirable about the substance of what he did, but there is something instructive about how he did it. His ability to survive, to adapt, to think strategically rather than impulsively, to build coalitions rather than simply dominating through force. These were the qualities that separated him from hundreds of other gangsters who lived and died in obscurity. The message he sent that morning after his attack was not just a threat to 3 killers. It was a declaration to the entire underworld. It said that Lucky Luciano played by different rules, that he operated on a different level, that attempting to eliminate him through conventional means would not work. It established a psychological barrier that protected him more effectively than any bodyguard or fortress. Men who might have challenged him, who might have seen an opportunity to take over his operations or eliminate a rival, hesitated. They remembered what happened to the last people who tried. They remembered that Lucky Luciano was the man who came back from the dead. In the decades since his death, Lucky Luciano's story has been told and retold, dramatized in movies and television shows, analyzed in books and documentaries. The details have been embellished, mythologized, sometimes completely fabricated, but the core truth remains. A young immigrant from Sicily, driven by ambition and intelligence, navigating a world of extraordinary violence and corruption, survived an assassination attempt that should have killed him 10 times over, and used that survival to build one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. He transformed the mafia from a collection of ethnic street gangs into a sophisticated criminal corporation. He established structures and systems that outlived him and continue in various forms to this day. He proved that in the underworld, as in any competitive environment, the greatest weapon is not violence but intelligence, Not strength, but strategy. Not fearlessness, but the ability to turn fear into power. That October night in 1929, when 3 hitmen dragged Lucky Luciano from a car and beat him and stabbed him and left him bleeding in the sand, they thought they were ending a story. Instead, they were beginning one. They were creating the legend of the man who could not be killed, the gangster who survived the unsurvivable, the criminal mastermind who turned attempted murder into the foundation of an empire. And the message he sent them the next morning, from his hospital bed, broken but alive, was the first chapter of a story that would reshape organized crime in America forever. It said simply and powerfully that Lucky Luciano was not just another gangster. He was something different, something unprecedented, something that would haunt the nightmares of his enemies for decades to come. He was a man who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. And in the criminal underworld, there is no power greater than that. The ultimate irony of Lucky Luciano's story is that the attempt on his life, meant to eliminate him as a threat, instead elevated him to untouchable status. Those 3 hitmen, whose names have been lost to history or deliberately erased, gave him the greatest gift possible. They proved that he could not be killed through conventional means. They demonstrated to everyone that the old methods, the old approaches, the old assumptions about how power worked in the underworld no longer applied when it came to Luciano. Every scar on his face became a badge of honor. Every painful step during his recovery became a demonstration of will. Every day he lived became proof of his exceptionalism. And the criminal empire he built on that foundation lasted long after he was gone, influencing the structure of organized crime not just in America, but around the world. This is the power of turning victimhood into mythology, of transforming a moment of extreme violence into a narrative of invincibility. This is why, nearly a century later, we still tell the story of what happened that night and what Lucky Luciano did about it the next morning. Because it was not just about survival. It was about creating a legend so powerful that reality had no choice but to bend around it.